What's up, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. I'm Swabras, and in today's video, we're going to be covering the differences between acrylic ink and watercolor. So we're just going to get right into it. I thought the best way to showcase the aspects of each medium is to paint the same abstract painting, one in acrylic ink and one in watercolor. The one on the left, I'm using Golden's High Flow liquid acrylic inks, and the one on the right, I'm using a watercolor palette that, to be honest, I don't remember what the brand is, but it's pretty much any watercolor palette that you can go to a craft store, pick up, and you'll be super happy with. To get started, I chose a color palette that had similar colors in both the watercolor and the acrylic ink, and it ended up being a turquoisey, bluish palette because you know we love those ocean vibes. And from there, I would lay down a layer of the water, drip in some of the acrylic ink, and let the ink really just do its thing. Once I finished a portion, I would move on to the watercolor and try to mimic the shape I had just created with the acrylic ink. So first, let's talk about what I learned about using acrylic ink. I think one of the beautiful things about using acrylic ink is really its unpredictability. It's unpredictable in the way the ink dries, in the way the ink reacts to other ink colors itself, and it's unpredictable in how it flows on the page. And for this reason, it lends itself to be a great medium to use in abstract paintings. Since in my abstracts, I really like the idea of just losing control and letting the medium do its thing, and acrylic ink just really likes to have a mind of its own. One of the other beautiful things about acrylic ink is the vibrancy in its colors. Is vibrancy a word? I know vibrant is. Either way, the vibrant colors in acrylic inks is one of the most beautiful things you can see. And especially when you put down a layer of water, let the ink drop into the water and see it spread out, and then drop different colors in there and see it mix together on that paper. Oh man, that is just one of the most beautiful things you can see, and I had a lot of fun messing around with that in this painting. So let's move on and talk about the watercolor. With watercolor, I was actually really excited to try and paint an abstract painting with the watercolor because I had never done abstract in watercolor before. I typically paint my pet portraits and human portraits and stuff like that in watercolor because I tend to be able to get pretty precise with watercolor, and so letting loose with this medium was a little bit scary, to be honest, but I had a lot of fun trying to mimic the acrylic ink pattern, and I think at the end of the day it held its own for sure. I noticed I definitely had a harder time with trying to mimic the flowiness of the acrylic ink. For instance, with the acrylic ink, I would lay down a layer of water, drop some of the ink in there, and it would just immediately spread and fill up the whole layer of water. Whereas with watercolor, I would lay down a layer of water, dip some watercolor in, and it wouldn't really spread that much, so the amount of watercolor paint that I would have to put on the page was probably twice as much to fill up the same area as the acrylic ink. And I would also have to have a lot more control with where the paint color ended, whereas with acrylic ink, it just kind of did its own thing. I also noticed that some of the colors weren't as vibrant. It's definitely more of a softer medium. It feels calmer and almost more pastel, a little bit less vibrant, but still super beautiful. Another thing I noticed with the watercolor in comparison to the acrylic ink was the difference in the hand motions that I would make. I noticed that with the watercolor, it was a lot more of these long motions with the paintbrush because I needed to make the paint go where I wanted. It wouldn't just spread on its own, and so there were a lot longer brush strokes with the watercolor, whereas with the acrylic ink, there were lots of little dabby motions. Now with the acrylic ink, there were longer brush strokes when I was laying down the water, but really, once I laid that water down, it was very small motions. I didn't have to do a lot with my hand to get the paint to go where it wanted to, and with the watercolor, I needed to put the paintbrush on a certain part of the paper to get that color there. So there was much more control and precision needed with the watercolor. And with the acrylic, it just, like I said before, did its own thing and had a mind of its own. And because of these hand motions, I think that that's why once the painting was all dry, there were a lot more even layers of color in the watercolor. Whereas with the acrylic ink, there were a lot of intense spots of color where I would drop the acrylic ink and then it would kind of spread out a little bit with less vibrancy. And with the watercolor, there would be really even layers of color, and the way it would dry would be really even, and that's why watercolor is so great for layering different colors on top of it. I do a lot of these sorts of paintings over on my Twitch channel, link in the description below if you're curious and would like to see me paint these things live. But I have a really fun time talking to everyone and kind of explaining what I'm doing in real time and getting advice from people. So please feel free to check out my Twitch channel. I stream every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday. There was a little self-promotion plug right there, but no shame. And here we fast forward a little bit, I let it dry for a couple hours, and now is probably one of the most satisfying parts of any painter's career is the untaping of the painting. This is the acrylic ink close-up. I wanted to get a close-up of the details and how the ink looks once it's actually dry. It looks completely different than it does when it's wet. So that's part of the excitement of using acrylic ink is it's unpredictable from beginning to end. And then here is the watercolor. You can tell it feels just a little bit softer. The colors feel a little bit more pastel, and the way that the colors have dried, they're a little bit more even and blend together much more. And with that, that is the difference between acrylic ink and watercolor. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. All right, I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.